That's first and foremost. Now, second off, this is not medical disinformation, what he was saying. Like, everybody talks as if the idea that masks are effective tools is a given. And it's so far from a given that it's remarkable. And I guess here's the distinction I want to draw. Shawn, if I wear a mask, is it going to block some droplets that come out of my mouth?
Sure.
Sure. Is it even going to probably block some aerosols that come out of my mouth?
Sure, probably.
Right. The problem is, if you have a million aerosol particles and it blocks 3, how effective is that as a measure?
None.
Thank you. All right. So when somebody says they block some aerosols, please understand that doesn't mean anything, because the word is effectively. Is it efficient? Is it effective? Does it have a significant impact? And the answer to that, overwhelmingly by the data, is no. So now I'm going to take issue specifically with Upstate Health here in Syracuse, New York. They put something out called The Year in Review and a Path Forward, COVID-19 and Schools. The Year in Review and a Path Forward. Now, obviously, they recommend universal masking on every teacher, every student, every administrator, every bus driver, regardless of vaccine status, for the safety, for the protection. Quoting directly from the article, just so you see where I'm going through here. Quote, available data suggests that properly wearing a face mask, appropriate fit with coverage of chin, nose, and mouth, is effective in limiting school transmission of SARS-CoV-2, even with increased population counts in school buildings, poor ventilation, high community transmission, and limited distancing. And to do that, they got the little subtext or supertext numbers for footnotes. 9, 10, and 11. 9 is a study called Incidence and Secondary Transmission of SARS-CoV-2 by a guy named Zimmerman. Number 10 is by somebody named Falk and is called COVID-19 Cases and Transmission in 17 K through 12 schools, Wood County, Wisconsin. That's number 10. And number 11, lead author is Gettings, Mask Use and Ventilation Improvements to Reduce COVID-19 Incidents in Elementary Schools. So, what do these studies actually say? Well, now remember, the claim is the data suggests that properly wearing a face mask is effective in limiting school transmission. That's the claim. So, number 9, the Zimmerman study. Direct quote, the reasons for district success in limiting secondary transmission were not formally tested. What? That's your proof, even though they weren't formally tested. Okay. Another quote, nor could we determine the relative effectiveness of any specific school policies. So what this study did was they studied about 90,000 students around North Carolina. They had no way of breaking down who was and was not wearing masks. It was all a voluntary submission via a survey, of which less than half of the schools submitted surveys. So no selection bias, because if you get asked to fill this survey out and you're super on board with masking, you're probably filling it out, right? And if you're not, do you think you'll be as inclined to voluntarily share this information?
Not me.
No, not in general. But again, out of 90,000 students, 773 community-acquired cases with 32 school cases, meaning school cases, 0.03% of these cases, of the overall study group of the 90,000 kids, 0.03. That's a rounding error, all right? No control group, 0 instances of a child to adult transmission. This study did not even measure the effectiveness of masks. So I don't know how you can use that to claim, well, it's a given that masks are effective at limiting spread in schools. So that's one that I took issue with. Study number 10, the Falk study. Mask compliance based on voluntary surveys. Half the teachers submitted surveys. No data whatsoever collected on masks on teachers. No control group, 0 instances of kid-to-adult transmission. Direct quote, it was not possible to determine the specific roles that mask wearing and other disease mitigation strategies played in the low rate of disease spread. Not possible to determine this role mask wearing played in the low rate of disease spread. Upstate Health used that study to say masks are effective at limiting in-school transmission. I feel like maybe that's not your best evidence. Okay, well, hang on. There's another one.
Oh, good.
Study 11, the Gettings study. This was even funnier because this was in Georgia. 11% of schools were included in the study. Overall, 0.6% of students tested positive for COVID. Now, they did have some school districts not wearing masks and others that did, and they said, well, it was like a 37% increase in school cases in the schools that did not wear masks and other measures. It wasn't just masks. So no masks in those schools, there was roughly a positivity rate of 0.7%. And full mask, full distancing, every measure known to man, 0.5. Now, if that is not proof positive, when you can go from 0.5% of cases to 0.7, I don't know what is.
I mean, I don't know what's wrong with you.
Obviously. All cases were self-reported, and prevention strategies might not reflect day-to-day activities and, quote, did not include an assessment of compliance, e.g. mask use. They have no idea, even in the schools that didn't require it, how many were wearing masks, or in the schools that did want it, how the masks were being worn. All right, awesome. And, of course, another quote that we can use is Upstate apparently did not read these studies. Finally, the data from this cross-sectional study cannot be used to infer causal relationships. The data cannot be used to establish any causation.
Cite it.
And these are the three that they point to say, see, it's a given that masks work. That's nonsense. Now, another line that they actually got right. With limited in-school transmission of SARS-CoV-2, K through 12 schools do not contribute to community transmission. No cite on that one, but it's generally accepted at this point. So good job, Upstate. You got one right. Here we go now. Can't just get one. Direct quote again. However, instances of SARS-CoV-2 transmission within school buildings have definitively occurred under circumstances of masking non-adherence or during mealtime sports and in students with special educational needs and their staff caretakers. Now, they cite study number 9. Hang on, let me back up. So what they're basically saying, what they're trying to imply without saying is that, well, this stuff spreads in the cases where they're not wearing masks, as if it doesn't spread where they are wearing masks without saying it. So this is how you lie without actually lying. You just mislead people. But again, let's look to the studies. The Zimmerman study that we already said, again, determined the relative effectiveness of any specific school policy. So I'm not sure that that's a proper conclusion to draw. And then the other ones they cite for that are, I'm sorry. Yeah, I got that one right. The Gettings one. Yep. 12 through 14. Those are the new ones. So we got more studies. Now, conveniently, number 12 is also by Zimmerman et al.
He's a worker.
Effect of community surge on within school transmission of SARS-CoV-2. It's basically the same exact data set. It's the same exact thing, except applying it as if it was when the community cases go up, do schools also go up? And they did at least attempt a control group on this one, which they said, well, there's no instances here, and they're doing a lot of masking. But we know in Tel Aviv, they had really bad school incidents without high community cases. But in England, they didn't. And that was the end of what they compared it to. Now, we're going to get to the Tel Aviv thing in just a minute. So let's just say, again, not a sound scientific study that you could base this assertion on. So let's go to 13. Gettings. Oh, the same guy that was in 11. Maybe it's female. I don't really know. I've read the studies, but I didn't look up the authors. Gettings et al. SARS-CoV-2 transmission in a Georgia school district. Boy, that sounds familiar. But this one was published in the I don't know what it is, the Clinician of Infectious Diseases, and the other one was cited in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. So I guess it's two different studies if you publish the same thing in two different outcomes, or in two different publications. So, looking at that case once again, the Gettings case, all cases self-reported, 0.7% positivity rate to 0.5%, and finally, the data from this cross-sectional study cannot be used to infer causal relationships. And what did Upstate do exactly with that study?
They did exactly what they told not to do.
They inferred a causal relationship. Man, science is fun. All right, now we got to go to 13. Oh, that was 13. That was the second Gettings one.
Yeah.
All right, 14. This is Doyle. We got a new scientist.
Diversity.
COVID-19 in primary and secondary school settings during the first semester of school reopening, Florida. Now, for our loyal listeners, you may recall us talking about this one a few months ago and how laughably flawed this study was. But let's go through it again,
yes.
just from memory lane. Study compared districts in Florida that required mass distancing, etc., to school districts that did not require any mitigation measures. Larger schools tended to have more mitigation measures in place and more mask mandates than the smaller rural schools that tended to not have them in Florida. And they counted a school case as any time a person, a student, a teacher, or a worker tested positive and was on school grounds for any reason in the previous 2 weeks. So you didn't need symptoms, a positive PCR test, and you happen to be on school grounds within the last 2 weeks, which if you're in-person schooling, you're probably going to have been on the school grounds in the previous 2 weeks, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless of the masking, the non-masking, the large schools, the small schools, less than 1% of all the students had any even positive PCR tests for COVID-19, let alone symptomatic cases. But okay. Schools with the mask mandates had an overall infection rate of 1.171. I'm sorry, the less than 1% was school cases that they could actually causally link back to the schools. Overall infection rate among the students, K through 12, 1.171% of students that had the mask mandates. If they didn't have mask mandates and all these other mitigation strategies, 1.667. So again, what are we doing? Let's go for rounding errors and say whether you do it or not, you're between a 1 to 2% efficacy ratio or risk of getting COVID. If you wear a mask or you don't wear a mask, you're somewhere 1 to 2%. Would you really shout somebody down and be like, well, then you better do it because the difference between 1.1 and 1.6 is unacceptable, especially when none of them are developing symptoms. And again, no instances of child to adult transmission.
I mean, if you're trying to scare people or mislead them, sure.
Yeah. So this is the studies actually cited by Upstate Hospital. Now, I am not a scientist. I am not a doctor. I'm none of these things. These are smart, qualified people that work at Upstate. Explain to me how you cite these studies as proof that masks have a causal effect on the spread of COVID when the studies themselves say there is no way to infer a causal relationship. We did not study masks specifically. There's no way to know which one it was. That's fine, but you can't cite them. You can't use those to claim something that the study's authors specifically say you cannot take this away from this study. This is madness. So let's go to the Tel Aviv study.